Greetings, everyone. This evening, we'll delve into the obscured pages of history, into a realm that existed beneath fortifications, behind defensive ramparts, and within the concealed recesses of medieval settlements. We embark on an exploration of medieval prisons, environments that the majority of individuals seldom witnessed, rarely discussed, and fervently hope to never encounter. This is not solely about masonry and metal. It pertains to the unseen framework of authority, fear, and endurance that defined an entire epoch. Prior to commencing this descent, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate the content I provide. I am not holding you captive, unlike the systems we are about to examine. Kindly inform me in the comments section where you are viewing from and what the current time is for you. It is consistently fascinating to observe our global audience. Now let us diminish the lights. Perhaps activate a fan for a gentle ambient drone. And together, let us ease into tonight's exploration. Close your eyes for a brief instant and envision traversing a medieval city at twilight. The thoroughfares are narrow, meandering between timbered edifices that seem to lean in, as if sharing secrets. Church bells resonate in the distance. Vendors are dismantling their market stalls. Children frolic in the diminishing daylight. All appears ordinary, almost serene. Yet beneath this veneer, quite literally beneath your feet in certain instances, exists a wholly distinct universe. A realm of stone chambers, barred gateways, and human beings who have been severed from society, secreted away where most citizens would never behold them, never hear them, never contemplate them. This is the concealed domain of medieval incarceration, and it functioned according to principles and rationales that most people never grasped. It was not publicly announced. It was not a topic of dinner-table conversation. It simply existed. A clandestine system running parallel to daily existence, occasionally intersecting but predominantly remaining separate, imperceptible, forgotten. The very notion of a hidden penal system reveals something significant about medieval society. In contrast to contemporary correctional facilities, which are frequently visible institutions with explicit objectives and public scrutiny, medieval prisons were intentionally recondite. They were not designed to be observed. They were not intended for understanding. Their purpose was to render individuals invisible, to remove impediments from public perception, to establish a space where societal norms held no sway. This obscurity was not incidental. It was intrinsic, embedded within the very blueprint of these establishments. When a prison is constructed in the lower levels of a fortress, accessible only through a sequence of secured portals and spiraling stairwells, one is not merely establishing security but also invisibility. One is ensuring that occurrences within those depths remain confined to that domain, known only to a select cadre. The custodians, the governing authorities, and the incarcerated individuals themselves. The spatial arrangement of medieval detention facilities mirrors this imperative for concealment. They were situated in locales that offered security, yet were also discreet. Dungeon chambers within castles were buried beneath strata of stone, their points of entry obscured by formidable doors and passageways never trod by common folk. Urban jails were frequently integrated into pre-existing constructions, watchtowers, antiquated defenses, repurposed structures, thereby blending seamlessly into the urban fabric without attracting undue attention. Consider the White Tower in London, erected by William the Conqueror in the year 1066. Its sub-basement levels comprise chambers specifically designated for the confinement of individuals of paramount political standing. These were not additions made during subsequent refurbishments. They were integral to the initial architectural schematics, excavated from the bedrock beneath the tower's foundation. The stonework in these lower chambers is more rudimentary than the dressed ashlar of the illuminated levels above, suggesting that the builders understood these areas would not be viewed by those whose opinions mattered. The ingress to these subterranean prisons followed a deliberate schema of disorientation. One would descend a spiral staircase that turned to the right, compelling any escapee to ascend while exposing their defenseless flank to adversaries positioned above. The stairs themselves were irregularly spaced, a subtle architectural cruelty rendering ascent in darkness nearly impossible without a misstep. The ceiling height diminished with each successive level, so that by the time the lowest chambers were reached, one could no longer stand erect. This progressive constriction was not accidental. It was a psychological architecture devised to subjugate the spirit prior to afflicting the body. With each downward step, the weight of the superstructure above was felt, the narrowing of options, the literal diminution of one's corporeal presence in the world. Some of the most effective correctional facilities were those that, from an external perspective, bore no resemblance to prisons. The Clink, a notorious medieval jail in London, was incorporated into the estate of the Bishop of Winchester. From the street, it appeared merely as another segment of the bishop's extensive holdings. Passers-by had no inkling that behind those reputable walls, men and women languished in conditions designed to break them in ways that left no visible scars. The Venetians elevated this art of concealment to a refined level. The Bridge of Sighs, linking the Doge's palace to the prison, was not constructed until the year 1595, yet it represented an advancement of principles that had guided Venetian penal architecture for centuries. Incarcerated individuals transitioned from the opulence of the palace, adorned with marble and gold leaf, into the correctional facility via an enclosed bridge, thus allowing citizens below to proceed with their daily lives, never witnessing the condemned being escorted to their final destiny. However, the Venetian innovation extended further. Beneath the Bridge of Sighs lay the Piombi, the leads, a series of cells constructed beneath sea level. The nomenclature was grimly descriptive. Water constantly permeated the poorly constructed stonework, engendering perpetual dampness that fostered illness and intensified the chill. The cells were diminutive, measuring approximately 6 feet by 6 feet, with ceilings so low that tall individuals could not stand upright. The tidal ebb and flow of the Adriatic meant that water levels within the Piombi fluctuated with the lunar cycle. During peak tides, water could reach ankle depth. During exceptionally high tides or storms, it could ascend further. Prisoners learned to repose on stone ledges, keeping their blankets, in the event they possessed any, above the waterline. The ubiquitous sound of water, dripping, flowing, occasionally surging when tempests drove the Adriatic against the prison's external ramparts, was constant. The environmental conditions within these hidden spaces were a direct consequence of their seclusion. Because they were subterranean or deeply integrated within larger edifices, they existed in a perpetual state of semi-darkness. Natural illumination rarely penetrated these depths. Ventilation was exceedingly limited. The temperature remained constant, frigid in northerly climes, oppressively warm in southerly ones, as the surrounding stone insulated the cells from seasonal variations. This environmental isolation engendered a peculiar perception of time. Within the concealed world of medieval prisons, temporal progression was distorted. Absent the sun to delineate the passage of days, devoid of changing seasons to offer temporal markers, prisoners lost their connection to the established rhythms of ordinary life. Days coalesced into nights. Weeks became indistinguishable from months. We glean this from infrequent testimonies of individuals who were eventually liberated. Roger Mortimer, incarcerated within the Tower of London in the year 1322, following his failed revolt against King Edward II, subsequently recounted his confinement as existing beyond the measure of time. He was genuinely unable to ascertain whether his imprisonment had lasted for months or years when he finally orchestrated his escape. The pervasive darkness had effectively erased chronology. The climate within these confines constituted its own micro-environment, distinct from the world above. Humidity was persistent, condensation forming on cold stone surfaces, water seeping through fissures, dampness permeating all materials. This unceasing moisture exerted a profound influence. It amplified the sensation of cold, penetrating clothing and skin. It fostered the proliferation of mold and fungi on walls, floors, and even on the prisoners themselves. It generated an atmosphere that felt weighty and oppressive, as if the very air exerted downward pressure. Within the dungeons of Château Gaillard, constructed by Richard the Lionheart in the 1190s, engineers discovered during 20th century restoration efforts that the prison cells had been deliberately positioned to maximize moisture accumulation. Drainage channels, which should have diverted water away from the cells, instead directed it towards them. The stone utilized in the cell construction was more permeable than that of the fortress's exterior walls, ensuring that dampness would infiltrate rather than be repelled. This was not a failure of engineering. It was malevolence rendered in stone. In coastal territories, the concealed correctional facilities often extended below sea level, and the proximity to water presented unique challenges. Tidal fluctuations could cause water levels to rise and fall within the cells themselves. Prisoners in these locations lived with the constant awareness of the sea pressing against the walls, threatening to breach them and inundate their already wretched quarters. The dungeons of Mont Saint-Michel, situated on a tidal island off the coast of Normandy, exemplify this specific form of torment. The lowest cells, known as the oubliettes, literally the forgotten places, were completely submerged during spring tides. Those prisoners who survived these periodic inundations did so by clinging to iron rings affixed high on the walls, their legs submerged in seawater so frigid that it could induce hypothermia even during the summer months. The auditory experience of dripping, flowing, and occasionally surging water became the prevailing soundtrack of incarceration within these coastal dungeons. It served as a stark reminder that the demarcation between prison and sepulchre was maintained solely by stone barriers and the will of those who held dominion over them. The historical evolution of concealed detention centers demonstrates how societies progressively devised methods for causing individuals to vanish. During the initial medieval era, spanning roughly the 5th through 8th centuries, incarceration was not a prevalent sentence. Upon committing an offense, penalties were immediate: fines, corporal chastisement, banishment, or capital punishment. The concept of detaining someone for prolonged durations was uncommon due to its expense and logistical complexity. This paradigm began to shift with the formation of feudal power structures. As monarchs and feudal lords consolidated their dominion, they required instruments for managing political dissent that were less overt than immediate execution. It was not feasible to eliminate every adversary. This practice generated martyrs and incited retribution. Conversely, adversaries could be made to disappear, held indefinitely in locations known only to a select few trusted individuals. By the 12th and 13th centuries, an elaborate network of hidden prisons had emerged across Europe. These facilities were not centrally organized or standardized. Each region, each governing body, and each fortification adopted its own methodology, yet they shared common attributes. They were discreet, secure, and largely operated beyond public scrutiny. The Anjou kings of England were particularly proficient at establishing clandestine imprisonment systems. They constructed dungeons within their castles throughout their territories, from England to France, thereby creating a network of secure containment sites where individuals could be transferred, concealed, and forgotten. Records from this epoch are intentionally scarce, but occasional entries in royal ledgers indicate payments to custodians, expenditures for restraints and locks, and enigmatic mentions of prisoners being relocated between locations. One such entry from the pipe rolls of 1189 documents a disbursement of 3 marks for iron chains at Corfe and 7 shillings for the sustenance of a prisoner in obscurity. The identity of this individual remains unspecified. Their transgression is unmentioned. They simply exist as an accounting item in a financial document, a phantom within the archives. This deliberate lack of transparency served several objectives. It deterred any attempts at rescue by the prisoner's associates if the detainment location was unknown. It precluded the generation of public sympathy by ensuring that the vast majority remained unaware of the imprisonment. Furthermore, it offered plausible deniability, allowing rulers to disclaim knowledge of a prisoner's treatment or even their existence if inquiries were made. The design of secret prisons necessitated specialized expertise. One could not simply excavate a pit and designate it a dungeon. These spaces had to possess sufficient security to thwart escape, be concealed effectively to avoid detection, and be robust enough to endure for generations. Medieval engineers developed sophisticated techniques for constructing these covert sites. A prevalent method involved integrating prison cells into the foundational structure of larger edifices. During the construction of a castle or fortress, engineers would conceptualize the lowest levels as potential detention areas, featuring thick walls, minimal apertures, and easily controllable entry points. These areas were so seamlessly incorporated into the building's framework that an individual unfamiliar with the design might never suspect their presence. The foundations of Dover Castle showcase a prime example of this technique. These lower chambers, excavated directly into the chalk cliffs, were carved from the bedrock rather than assembled from transported masonry. This rendered them virtually escape-proof, as tunneling through solid chalk with improvised implements was impossible, and it ensured their invisibility from external vantage points. No exterior walls betrayed their location. They simply did not feature in the castle's observable profile. Another technique involved repurposing pre-existing subterranean spaces. Antiquated Roman cisterns, natural caverns, and disused wells, any underground cavity, could potentially be converted into a prison with the addition of iron gratings, chains, and locks. This approach was cost-effective and benefited from the inherent concealment of these spaces. Beneath the city of Edinburgh, a network of vaults constructed to support the South Bridge served as an improvised detention system during periods of overcrowding in the official facilities. These spaces were never intended for human occupancy. They were designed as storage areas and workshops. However, their isolation and the ease with which access could be controlled made them suitable for housing prisoners when other facilities were at capacity. The conditions within these repurposed areas were frequently more severe than in purpose-built prisons. They lacked even the minimal provisions that architects might incorporate into designed confinement spaces. Drainage was either deficient or non-existent, and ventilation was inadequate. Their structural integrity was uncertain, yet they fulfilled the primary objective. They sequestered individuals from public view. The most sophisticated hidden prisons incorporated multiple layers of security and concealment. A prisoner might be confined within a cell accessed through a series of latched doors, each situated in a distinct corridor and requiring a separate key. This multi-tiered approach meant that even if an individual managed to escape their cell, they would encounter numerous additional impediments before achieving freedom. It also ensured that knowledge of the prison's layout was compartmentalized. A guard might know how to reach one section, but not others, and a jailer might control access to specific cells without overseeing the entire facility. This prevented any single individual from possessing complete awareness of the system, rendering coordinated escapes or rescue attempts nearly impossible. The Tower of London exemplifies this strategy. A prisoner confined in the Beauchamp Tower was separated from freedom by 6 distinct locked doors, each under the control of a different official. The constable of the tower held keys to the outer gates. The chief warder managed access to the internal towers, and individual warders possessed keys to specific floors and chambers. Even if a prisoner somehow acquired one key, they would still confront multiple locked barriers. Ventilation posed a significant engineering challenge in the construction of hidden prisons. Without adequate airflow, prisoners risked suffocation or succumbing to concentrated noxious gases emanating from waste and decay. Medieval engineers addressed this by incorporating narrow shafts that connected the cells to the exterior. These shafts were too constricted for a person to ascend, yet sufficiently wide to permit some air circulation. Often, these shafts were engineered with multiple turns and bends to prevent any external visibility into the cells or the use of the shafts for communication with the surface. At Château de l'Eau in France, the ventilation shafts in the lower dungeons undertake 6 90-degree turns before reaching ground level. This facilitated air circulation while rendering visual or acoustic communication impossible. In some instances, These ventilation shafts themselves served as instruments of torture. The opening at the top could be obstructed, gradually suffocating prisoners below, or they could be utilized to introduce smoke, noxious odors, or even sewage into the cells. The same engineering that sustained prisoners' lives could be weaponized to render that existence unbearable. The architectural design of hidden prisons was an architecture of absence. These were conceived as non-places, locations that existed but were not acknowledged, which held individuals but were not habitations, and which were integral to a castle or city yet remained distinct from it. Traversing the remnants of medieval prisons today, one can perceive this quality of absence. The spaces are present: the stone walls, the iron rings, the narrow passageways. But they feel vacant in a manner that transcends the mere lack of occupants. They convey a sense of places never intended for habitation, designed to negate human presence rather than accommodate it. Within the dungeons of Warwick Castle, this sensation is palpable. The oubliette there is a bottle-shaped chamber excavated from the bedrock beneath Caesar's Tower. The sole access point is a circular aperture in the ceiling, scarcely wide enough for a human body to pass through. Once lowered inside, a prisoner found themselves in absolute darkness, standing in whatever accumulated at the bottom: water, waste, the remains of previous occupants. The shape was deliberate. The chamber widened below the entrance, rendering escape impossible. Even if a prisoner could somehow reach the opening above, they could not ascend through it from below due to their shoulders' inability to compress sufficiently to pass through the narrow neck. This was the acme of cruel ingenuity in architecture. Every component served the dual purpose of confinement and psychological devastation. The cells themselves varied considerably in design, but they shared certain characteristics. They were diminutive, often barely sufficient for a person to lie down. The dungeon cell at Chillingham Castle in Northumberland measures 5 feet by 7 feet. The ceiling height is 5 feet, 3 inches. An individual of average stature could neither stand upright nor recline diagonally across the space. This cramped dimension was intentional. It precluded any form of physical activity, leading to muscle atrophy. It made sleep difficult and unrefreshing, fostering a perpetual state of physical discomfort that over time evolved into a form of torture, requiring no active intervention from jailers. The cells were devoid of natural light. A chamber at the base of Bow Cathedral, repurposed as a prison in the 13th century, received illumination solely through so narrow a gap in the stonework that noon sunlight penetrated for precisely 12 minutes per day. For 23 hours and 48 minutes, prisoners existed in absolute darkness. This darkness was not merely an inconvenience, it was physiologically and psychologically devastating. In the absence of light, the human body's circadian rhythms disintegrate. Sleep becomes fragmented and unsatisfying. Depression deepens, and hallucinations become common as the brain, starved of visual input, begins generating its own imagery. They were isolated, positioned such that prisoners could not easily communicate with one another. Even when cells were in close proximity, robust walls and deliberate sound absorption measures rendered communication exceedingly difficult. The incarceration facilities within Vincent Castle, located near Paris, were constructed with cells separated by multiple layers of stone, earth, and lead. This combination effectively stifled sound, ensuring that a prisoner's cries would be inaudible to an individual in an adjacent cell. Such acoustic seclusion served a variety of functions. It thwarted prisoners' ability to strategize and coordinate escape attempts. It prevented them from exchanging information or offering mutual assistance. Furthermore, it fostered a profound sense of psychological isolation, which proved more effective in breaking prisoners than physical torment. These structures were also built for enduring, with a lifespan intended to span centuries, outlasting numerous successive generations of both inmates and custodians. The choice of building materials for prisons underscored this inherent durability. While the visible sections of castles might utilize relatively yielding limestone, amenable to decorative carving, Prison cells were constructed from harder stones such as granite, basalt, and slate. These resilient materials resisted wear and, crucially, prevented inmates from excavating their way to freedom. The mortar binding the stones in prison walls frequently incorporated pulverized iron or lead, rendering it harder than the stones themselves. Efforts in the 20th century to refurbish medieval prisons have often necessitated diamond-tipped cutting instruments, as conventional masonry tools were incapable of penetrating the hardened mortar. This enduring construction carried a somber implication. These prisons were not merely intended for their present occupants, but for all those who would be incarcerated in the future. They represented a commitment to the practice of clandestine imprisonment that transcended individual rulers or prevailing political climates. They constituted investments in the infrastructure of concealment. Certain hidden prisons integrated psychological deterrence into their architectural design. Cells could be positioned at unconventional angles, featuring sloping floors or ceilings that induced a sense of disorientation. The dungeon complex situated beneath the Papal Palace in Avignon includes cells where the floor inclines at a 7-degree angle. This subtle gradient is nearly imperceptible when stationary, but impedes locomotion and generates a perpetual feeling of instability. Passageways might be designed with curves that limited visibility to mere feet ahead, fostering a sensation of being trapped in an interminable, maze-like confinement. The pathways connecting cells in the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome were meticulously designed to disorient. They branch, double back, and feature deceptive dead ends that mimic possible exits, only to terminate in solid walls. Prisoners being transported through these corridors, blindfolded or in darkness, would rapidly lose their spatial orientation. This disorientation served both practical and psychological ends. It prevented inmates from memorizing the prison's layout, rendering escape planning infeasible. Concurrently, it instilled a dreamlike quality into the imprisonment, where uncertainty prevailed, and the very fabric of reality seemed fragile. These architectural decisions were not arbitrary. They were deliberate strategies employing space itself as a mechanism of control. Medieval architects understood the profound influence of environment on cognition by creating spaces inherently disorienting, uncomfortable, and oppressive. They effectively weaponized architecture. The attire of prisoners in hidden prisons offers considerable insight into their status and treatment. Unlike contemporary correctional facilities that mandate standardized uniforms, medieval inmates wore the clothing they possessed at the moment of their apprehension. This imparted a peculiar temporal dimension to their imprisonment. Their garments became a frozen tableau from their former lives, gradually succumbing to decay as their incarceration persisted. For affluent prisoners, this entailed the wearing of fine fabrics and elaborate garments that slowly disintegrated in the humid conditions. A nobleman apprehended at court might find himself still clad in silk hose and a velvet doublet weeks later, witnessing these costly items literally disintegrate from his person. The stark contrast between the quality of the attire and its degradation served as a palpable metaphor for the prisoner's fall from grace. Sir Walter Raleigh, incarcerated in the Tower of London from 1603 to 1616, managed to maintain his fine clothing for the majority of his confinement due to his financial capacity to commission new garments. However, accounts from other prisoners describe nobles reduced to wearing rags because their families were either unable to afford or chose not to provide replacement clothing. For indigent prisoners, this meant coarse wool or linen that was already worn upon their arrival and rapidly devolved into rags. The peasant cloth, designed for arduous labor, was ill-suited to the conditions of medieval imprisonment. Perpetual dampness caused fibers to weaken and fracture. Rough handling by guards and abrasive stone surfaces accelerated decay. The deterioration of clothing marked the passage of time in a visceral and unavoidable manner. One could gauge the duration of their imprisonment by the condition of their garments: the expanding holes, the fraying seams, the accumulating stains. A tunic that was intact upon arrival might lose its sleeves within a month. After 3 months, the main body of the garment could be in tatters. After 6 months, one might possess barely enough fabric to maintain modesty. Some prisoners received new clothing from family members or through clandestine arrangements with jailers. However, such instances were infrequent and costly. The logistical challenges of delivering new clothes to a hidden prisoner were considerable. Firstly, one needed to ascertain their exact location. Secondly, it required finding a jailer amenable to accepting payment. Thirdly, there was the crucial element of trust, ensuring the garments would indeed reach the prisoner, rather than being misappropriated by the jailer for personal gain. The majority of inmates simply witnessed their clothing disintegrate, piece by piece, until only the barest minimum remained to preserve their modesty. This gradual divestment of proper attire served as another form of erasure, another method by which the clandestine prison system removed individuals from society. Stripped of appropriate clothing, one was not merely imprisoned. One was reduced to a state of near nakedness, marking them as less than fully human. The symbolism of clothing within hidden prisons extended beyond mere utility. In medieval society, attire functioned as a distinct indicator of status, occupation, and identity. The robes of a merchant, the surcoat of a knight, the simple tunic of a peasant, these garments conveyed an individual's place in the social order. What one wore was not solely a personal prerogative, but was often regulated by sumptuary laws, dictating permissible fabrics, colors, and styles for each social stratum. Within the hidden recesses of a prison, denuded of proper clothing or witnessing it decay beyond recognition, prisoners forfeited this visible identity. They transformed into anonymous figures, indistinguishable from one another in the pervasive darkness. A nobleman reduced to rags was, in outward appearance, identical to a peasant in a similar condition. The social hierarchies meticulously maintained in the world above dissolved in the Stygian depths below. This dissolution of identity through the decay of clothing was, in many respects, the intended outcome. Imprisonment was not solely about corporeal confinement. It was about social annihilation. By removing an individual from society and stripping away the markers of their identity, the prison system effectively rendered them socially deceased without expunging their biological existence. Some prisoners attempted to preserve their dignity by meticulously caring for their clothing to the best of their ability. They would wash their garments in whatever water was available, which was often contaminated and impure. They would attempt repairs using threads taken from hems or salvaged from other fabric fragments. They would endeavor to keep their clothes clean despite lacking soap and having minimal access to water. These efforts were generally futile. The perpetually damp conditions ensured that clothing never fully dried. Mold proliferated on the fabric, further weakening it. The abrasive stone walls and floors damaged any surface they encountered. Moreover, the simple reality of wearing the same clothes day after day, week after week, month after month, without the means for proper cleaning or maintenance, rendered deterioration inevitable. Nevertheless, the effort itself held significant meaning. By striving to maintain their attire, prisoners sought to preserve their humanity, their dignity, and their connection to the person they were prior to their incarceration. It represented an act of defiance against the prison system's attempt to reduce them to mere physical entities. The provision of sustenance in hidden prisons was meager and inconsistent, reflecting both the economic constraints of maintaining inmates and a deliberate policy of deprivation. The clandestine nature of these facilities offered little oversight regarding prisoner nourishment. Jailers could falsely report adequate rations while providing significantly less, thereby pocketing the difference for personal gain. The basic sustenance, when provided, typically consisted of bread and water. However, the quality of this bread varied immensely from what might be commonly conceived as bread. This was not the soft white bread familiar to contemporary palates. Medieval bread for prisoners was produced from the cheapest, lowest-grade grains available. Sometimes this involved bread made from maslin, a blend of wheat and rye, resulting in a coarse, dense loaf that was nutritious, albeit unappetizing. More frequently, it comprised bread derived from inferior grains such as barley, oats, or even ground peas and beans. This bread was dense, gritty, and barely palatable. During periods of scarcity, the bread might be adulterated by the inclusion of sawdust, ground bark, or other inedible materials. The 12th century text, Modus tenendi parlamentum, alludes to prisoners receiving bread mixed with that which is not bread, a euphemism for this practice. Some inmates received relatively fresh bread made from wheat or rye. Others were given bread that was days or weeks old, hard as stone, and occasionally moldy. The bread might be visibly green with mold, which formed in the same damp conditions that caused all other elements within the prison to deteriorate. Medieval individuals were aware that moldy bread was less desirable than fresh bread, but they lacked an understanding of the health risks associated with certain types of mold. Ergot fungus, which flourishes on rye and other grains, generates substances that induce hallucinations, seizures, and gangrene. Inmates who consumed bread contaminated with ergot might suffer from St. Anthony's fire, a malady that produced a burning sensation, convulsions, and gangrenous extremities. The visions brought on by ergot poisoning intensified the psychological torment of incarceration. Envision being confined in darkness, slowly starving, observing your body and garments deteriorate, and then beginning to perceive apparitions of demons or angels. The boundary between actuality and hallucination would become obscured. You might genuinely be unsure whether the terrors you were experiencing were real or induced by drugs. Water was procured from any readily available source. This could be a well, a cistern, or sometimes even collected rainwater. Its quality was unpredictable and frequently perilous. Wells situated within castle walls could become tainted by seepage from latrines or burial grounds. Cisterns, if not properly maintained, could transform into breeding grounds for bacteria. Rainwater gathered in containers might be pure when first collected, but would quickly become stagnant if stored for extended durations. Inmates drinking contaminated water faced immediate threats from waterborne illnesses. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera could devastate prisons, claiming the lives of dozens of inmates within days. These diseases provoked severe diarrhea, fever, and dehydration. Without sufficient water to replenish what was lost, prisoners perished swiftly and miserably. The inconsistent delivery of food served as a method of control and punishment in itself. Inmates never knew when the next meal would arrive. Occasionally, food was provided twice daily, sometimes once, and at other times, it might not be provided for days on end. This lack of predictability fostered a perpetual state of unease and precluded prisoners from establishing any semblance of routine or normalcy. In the dungeons of Warwick Castle, records indicate that prisoners in the oubliette received sustenance at the constable's discretion. This implied that the timing and quantity of food were entirely contingent upon the constable's inclination. If he felt magnanimous, or if the inmate had affluent relatives making payments, food might arrive regularly. Conversely, if he was in a poor mood, or if the prisoner lacked resources, days could elapse without any nourishment. This uncertainty prevented inmates from pacing themselves or making future plans. They had to consume whatever food was immediately offered, both because they were unaware of when additional sustenance would be provided, and because the rats that infested every prison would plunder anything left unguarded, even momentarily. Certain hidden prisons implemented systems whereby inmates were expected to finance their own food. Jailers would furnish meager rations without charge, but anything beyond that, superior bread, vegetables, meat, ale, had to be purchased. This established a hierarchical system where affluent prisoners could maintain a reasonably adequate diet, while impoverished inmates slowly wasted away. The economics of this arrangement were harsh and exploitative. Families of inmates would remit funds to the jailers, with the expectation that these funds would be used to procure food for their loved ones. A merchant's wife might send 2 shillings, anticipating that this sum would cover a week's worth of decent meals. However, the jailer might retain the majority of the money and provide rations only slightly superior to the free minimum. Often, the jailers would retain most of the funds and offer only marginally better rations than the free basic allotment. There was no recourse, no mechanism for families to confirm that their money was being utilized as intended. The clandestine nature of the prison system ensured that these transgressions remained concealed as well. A family might disburse substantial sums over months or years, believing they were ensuring their relatives' survival, when in reality, the prisoner was receiving almost nothing, and the jailer was appropriating the profits. This system fostered perverse incentives that intensified as imprisonment extended. Jailers benefited most from prisoners whose families continued to send money, but who never investigated the conditions. The longer a prisoner remained alive, barely, the more funds could be extracted from desperate families. Records from the Fleet Prison in London document one prisoner, Sir Robert Wingfield, whose family dispatched over £40 for his sustenance during a 3-year incarceration in the 1520s. The jailer claimed this entire sum was allocated to food and lodging, but upon Sir Robert's eventual release, he reported that his actual provisions had been valued at approximately £5 in total. The remaining £35 had seemingly vanished into the jailer's coffers. Hunger became a defining characteristic of existence within hidden prisons. It was not the acute hunger of missing a meal or two, but the chronic, debilitating hunger of insufficient nutrition sustained over months or years. This type of hunger impacted every facet of life. It engendered weakness, rendering individuals incapable of movement without succumbing to exhaustion. It caused a persistent chill, as the body lacked the fuel necessary to generate heat. It induced mental fog, impairing one's ability to think clearly or retain memories. It fostered an obsessive preoccupation with food, leading to dreams and hallucinations centered around it, to the exclusion of all else. Medieval individuals possessed an understanding of hunger that modern inhabitants of affluent nations typically do not. In favorable times, most peasants existed at the precarious edge of adequate nutrition. However, prison hunger was distinct. It was intentional, managed, and weaponized. It was not a consequence of failed harvests or adverse weather conditions, but a deliberate choice made by those in power to withhold sustenance from those under their charge. The psychological repercussions of prolonged hunger were profound and frequently permanent. Survivors of extended starvation often developed obsessive relationships with food that persisted long after their release. They might hoard food compulsively, unable to trust that their next meal was assured. They could overeat uncontrollably when food was available, their bodies and minds incapable of believing that scarcity would not return. The physical consequences were equally devastating and often irreversible. Prolonged starvation prompts the body to metabolize its own muscle tissue, including the cardiac muscle. Prisoners who endured months of near starvation might suffer from permanently weakened hearts. Malnutrition also compromises the immune system, rendering prisoners susceptible to every disease that permeated the prison. Vitamin deficiencies precipitated their own unique horrors. Scurvy, resulting from a lack of vitamin C, caused gums to swell and bleed, teeth to loosen and fall out, old wounds to reopen, and ultimately, death from internal hemorrhaging. Night blindness, stemming from vitamin A deficiency, further incapacitated prisoners in already dimly lit cells. Beriberi, caused by vitamin B1 deficiency, led to nerve damage, muscle weakness, and cardiac failure. These deficiency diseases were slow killers, requiring months to manifest their full effects. A prisoner might appear relatively healthy for the initial weeks or months, only to suddenly collapse as accumulated deficiencies reached critical thresholds. Furthermore, because jailers lacked an understanding of the role of vitamins in health, they were unaware of the reasons why seemingly stable prisoners would abruptly sicken and die. The daily existence of prisoners in hidden prisons was marked by monotony and unpredictability. Each day mirrored the one preceding it, yet each day held the potential for sudden alteration, a summons to trial, a transfer to another location, an unexpected release, or an equally unforeseen execution. Prisoners were devoid of activities, work, or responsibilities beyond the fundamental struggle for survival. They simply existed within their cells, waiting. Time lost its conventional meaning in the absence of sunlight to delineate days, without calendars, and without any external reference points. Temporal awareness dissolved. Some prisoners attempted to maintain routines, engaging in exercises, prayers, and mental games to preserve their sanity. These endeavors demanded immense willpower when every environmental factor conspired to stifle initiative. To exercise within a cell where standing upright is impossible requires ingenuity and resolve. To pray amidst evidence that God has forsaken you demands a faith of exceptional intensity. Exercise, where feasible, might involve nothing more than repeatedly standing and sitting or pressing against walls to preserve muscle tone. Certain prisoners devised intricate calisthenics adapted for confined spaces. They would meticulously count repetitions, transforming the count itself into a method of marking time and upholding mental discipline. Mental exercises were equally vital and equally arduous. Some prisoners would recite all they could recall, prayers, poems, songs, stories, repeatedly, to keep their minds engaged. They would mentally solve mathematical problems, untangle logical puzzles, or endeavor to reconstruct maps of places they had visited. Educated prisoners possessed an advantage in this regard. Those proficient in Latin could internally translate memorized texts. Those who had studied mathematics could work through geometric proofs. Those who had delved into philosophy could engage in debates with imagined adversaries. However, these mental resources proved of little value when malnutrition and despair rendered concentration impossible. Others resigned themselves and descended into a state of stupor, remaining motionless for hours, their minds retreating from the unbearable reality of their circumstances. This psychological withdrawal served as a form of self-preservation, a means of enduring by not fully experiencing, yet it also rendered them susceptible to deeper forms of mental deterioration. Catatonia, characterized by remaining motionless for extended periods, was prevalent among long-term prisoners. While medieval observers lacked this specific term, they described prisoners who would sit in the same posture for hours or days, unresponsive to stimuli, barely consuming food or drink. Some of these prisoners eventually expired in these positions, having effectively willed themselves out of existence. The concealed nature of these prisons meant that prisoners had no interaction with the external world apart from their jailers. They were unable to glimpse the sky, deaf to the city's clamor, and cut off from any tidings of events beyond their stone confines. This profound sensory deprivation was utterly devastating. The world they once knew moved onward without them, and they possessed no means of discerning its happenings. Their families might have been flourishing or suffering from extreme hunger. Their political objectives may have triumphed or been vanquished. Their sovereign could have perished and been succeeded. As seasons turned and years elapsed, they remained entombed in an unending darkness, severed from the stream of history. This intentional withholding of information was a deliberate act of cruelty. Captors understood that uncertainty was a potent form of torment in itself. By withholding news from the outside, they rendered every conceivable outcome equally plausible in the minds of their captives. A spouse might have remarried, believing their husband deceased. Children could have forgotten their father. The entirety of a prisoner's known world might have undergone a transformation beyond recognition. Certain inmates attempted to preserve a link to the outer world through recollection. They would traverse their homes in their minds, replaying each chamber, each piece of furnishings, every minute detail. They would revisit exchanges with cherished ones, reenacting them repeatedly. They would envision their families engaged in various daily activities. These mental exercises were endeavors to sustain their identity and maintain a connection amidst complete isolation. However, they were also profoundly sorrowful, serving as a constant reminder to prisoners of all they had forfeited. The solace found in picturing loved ones was inextricably linked to the agony of their absence. Some prisoners eventually discontinued these practices, as the pain began to overshadow any comfort. The mental cultivation of memories served another purpose. It inhibited the total erosion of identity. In the absence of external affirmation of oneself, memory served as the sole tether to one's prior existence. The ability to recall one's name, family, and history facilitated the maintenance of a degree of personal continuity. Yet, should these memories falter or become conflated with dreams and delusions, the risk of complete self-dissolution loomed large. The psychological toll of clandestine imprisonment inflicted devastation exceeding that of solitary physical torment. Unlike individuals incarcerated in more public institutions, who might receive visitors from family or clergy, who might be observed by fellow prisoners or guards, and who might retain some connection to the outside world, those confined in hidden prisons endured a unique form of social demise. They were so thoroughly removed from society that their existence might as well have ceased. Their kin and companions might have presumed them dead. Their possessions could have been seized and redistributed. Their names may have been forgotten or willfully expunged from records. They effectively became specters while still alive, physically present yet absent from the social sphere. This obliteration engendered a specific type of psychological anguish, which modern psychology would identify as an extreme manifestation of solitary confinement's effects. Humans are inherently social beings, defining themselves through their connections and interactions with others. When these relationships are entirely severed, when interactions are limited to captors who treat one as less than human, one's sense of self begins to fracture. The individual starts to question their own existence, their own perceived reality. Am I still the person I once was? Does anyone remember me? Do I still hold any meaningful existence? These are not abstract philosophical inquiries for prisoners. They represent urgent existential emergencies that can precipitate a complete psychological collapse. The contemporary understanding of social death was well apprehended by medieval governing bodies. Even without employing this specific terminology, they recognized that isolating an individual from all social engagement constituted a form of annihilation that, in certain respects, was more absolute than physical execution. An individual executed became a martyr, a lingering memory, potentially a focal point for their cause. An individual secreted away in darkness simply ceased to have relevance. Some prisoners grappled with this existential crisis by constructing elaborate inner realms. They would conjure companions, engage in dialogues with imaginary individuals, and fabricate detailed fantasies about their lives post-release. These mental constructs served as survival mechanisms, methods of preserving a semblance of social connection even in the face of total solitude. These imagined companions were not invariably human. A number of prisoners reported conversing with the divine, with saints, and with angelic beings. Others claimed to speak with malevolent spirits or with personified abstract concepts, such as justice or hope. The substance of these dialogues offers considerable insight into the prisoner's psychological states, their anxieties, aspirations, feelings of guilt, and profound desperation. One narrative from the 15th century recounts the experience of a prisoner in the Bastille who spent 3 years conversing with what he believed to be the spirit of Thomas Becket. The prisoner, a clerk incarcerated due to unpaid debts, stated that Becket would visit him each night, engaging in discussions on theology, politics, and the fundamental principles of justice. Upon his eventual release, the prisoner authored an account of these conversations, which achieved wide circulation and was regarded with seriousness by contemporary readers. Whether these visitations were manifestations of hallucinations, dreams, authentic spiritual encounters, or deliberate fabrications is beyond definitive ascertainment. However, the crucial element is that they provided this prisoner with a form of social engagement that rendered continued existence feasible. Without these nightly dialogues, he might have succumbed to complete mental derangement or simply chosen to end his life. Others found solace by immersing themselves in religious devotion. Prayer became a means of sustaining a relationship with the divine, with saints, and with celestial forces. This connection could not be disrupted by imprisonment, as it resided within the domain of faith rather than tangible reality. For a significant number of prisoners, religious piety was the sole bulwark against total psychological disintegration. This religiously based coping mechanism held particular potency within medieval society, as faith was not merely a personal conviction, but rather the foundational structure through which individuals comprehended existence. A prisoner who steadfastly maintained their faith could interpret their suffering as imbued with significance, as a divine trial, as an opportunity for spiritual advancement, or as atonement for transgressions. This infused their suffering with a purpose, rendering it more manageable than meaningless torment. Conversely, religious conviction could also amplify suffering. If one believed their imprisonment constituted divine retribution for their sins, they might accept their suffering as deserved, yet still bear the full weight of divine condemnation. If one perceived themselves as undergoing a test but began to falter, losing faith, succumbing to despair, or committing sins of thought or deed, they might feel themselves eternally damned, even while enduring temporal punishment. The spiritual crisis precipitated by imprisonment could be as devastating as the physical ordeal. Questions that might remain comfortably abstract in ordinary life became urgently concrete within the confines of a prison. Why does the divine permit suffering? What is the purpose of my existence? How ought I to respond to injustice? These inquiries lacked simple resolutions, and grappling with them in darkness and isolation could lead to spiritual as well as psychological breakdown. Some prisoners emerged from confinement with their faith fortified, convinced that divine providence had sustained them through insurmountable circumstances. Others experienced a complete loss of faith, incapable of reconciling a purportedly benevolent deity with the harsh reality of their suffering. Still others developed unorthodox beliefs, blending elements of Orthodox Christianity with concepts derived from desperation and isolation. The clandestine prison economy operated as a shadowy market, existing beyond conventional commercial channels and legal oversight. Every commodity possessed a price, yet these prices were arbitrary and subject to constant fluctuation, determined by the jailer's estimation of the prisoner's financial capacity and their degree of desperation. The fundamental economic transaction was straightforward. Prisoners or their families would compensate jailers in exchange for improved treatment. This could manifest as superior sustenance, cleaner water, a blanket, the removal of shackles, a cell offering marginally more light or air, or simply a respite from harassment. The demanded sums varied based on the jailer's assessment of the prisoner's affordability and level of desperation. This system fostered perverse incentives that permeated every facet of incarceration. Jailers desired prisoners to remain imprisoned for the longest possible duration, as this maximized revenue streams. They sought to ensure prisoners experienced sufficient discomfort to be motivated to pay for improvements, but not so profound misery that they perished prematurely. It was a delicate equilibrium, and jailers became adept at maintaining it. The hidden nature of these penal facilities meant that this economic exploitation remained largely imperceptible to official authorities. Even when these authorities were aware of its occurrence, they frequently condoned it, as it obviated the need to provide jailers with adequate remuneration. The system effectively funded itself, with prisoners and their families bearing the financial burden. Certain prisoners possessed neither funds nor family capable of providing financial support. These individuals occupied the lowest stratum of the prison hierarchy. They subsisted on minimal rations, received no enhancements to their living conditions, and were frequently subjected to mistreatment by jailers who viewed them as valueless. Many of these unfortunate souls perished within months of their confinement, their remains being interred without ceremony or any official record. The economic exploitation extended beyond simple gratuities for improved conditions. Jailers would occasionally sell prisoners to other jailers, transferring them to different locations for a fee. This practice served several objectives. It generated income for the vendor jailer, it permitted authorities to relocate prisoners without formal documentation, and it further disoriented the incarcerated individuals, diminishing the likelihood of escape or rescue. Jailers levied charges on prisoners for virtually every item. The chains they wore incurred a rental fee. The straw upon which they slept also required payment. The space they occupied seemed to be built on a rental basis. Even the water they consumed could have been classified as an amenity rather than a basic necessity. Upon release, if release was granted, inmates were presented with a bill for their entire incarceration and were not permitted to leave until the debt was settled. This created a predicament where even individuals found innocent at trial could face extended periods of imprisonment, simply because they lacked the funds to settle their accrued debts to the jailer. This practice of levying prison fees upon release, known as jail fees in England, persisted well into the 18th century, despite numerous reform efforts. The underlying rationale was straightforwardly perverse. The jailer had provided lodging and services during confinement, therefore payment was owed. The fact that these services were imposed on unwilling individuals and were often intentionally subpar was disregarded in this calculation. Records from Newgate Prison in London document a multitude of instances where prisoners acquitted of charges remained incarcerated for months or years thereafter, due to their inability to settle their fees. Some of these individuals ultimately perished in custody, still awaiting a release they had rightfully earned, but could not afford to purchase. This economic framework illuminated a core truth about medieval incarceration. Its primary purpose was extraction rather than punishment or rehabilitation. Prisons functioned, in part, to generate revenue for their administrators, and this profit motive dictated every facet of their operation. The mystique and folklore surrounding hidden prisons added layers of supernatural dread to an already terrifying reality, as these places were concealed because most people never encountered them. They consequently became the subject of wild speculation and dark legends. Tales circulated about what transpired in the subterranean depths beneath castles, often incorporating supernatural elements that amplified their perceived horror. A prevalent belief held that hidden prisons were haunted by the spirits of those who had died within them. These phantoms were reputed to roam the corridors, clanking chains, emitting mournful sounds of despair, seeking retribution against their captors, or simply unable to find peace. Jailers and guards purportedly heard inexplicable noises, glimpsed shadowy figures, and felt pockets of intense cold within certain cells. Whether these experiences constituted genuine paranormal activity, the result of guilty consciences and overactive imaginations, or simple misinterpretations of ambient sounds in aged structures, remains indeterminate. But they were widely accepted and became integral to the prison's identity and psychological landscape. Certain hidden prisons became associated with specific spectral narratives that permeated local lore. The Tower of London, for instance, boasts more ghost stories than perhaps any other edifice in Britain, many linked to specific prisoners who met their end there. Anne Boleyn was said to traverse the corridors bearing her severed head. The princes in the Tower, the young sons of Edward IV, who vanished and are presumed to have been murdered, were believed to haunt the rooms where they were last seen alive. These narratives served several purposes. They reinforced the Tower's notorious reputation as a place of terror, thereby enhancing the efficacy of threats of imprisonment there. They offered explanations for unexplained occurrences experienced by guards and officials within the building, and they provided a semblance of justice, suggesting that those who had been murdered or unjustly imprisoned might, at least in spectral form, achieve a posthumous presence. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, was reportedly heard to run screaming through the haunted gallery at Hampton Court Palace, desperately attempting to reach the chapel where her husband was at prayer to plead for clemency before her execution. Guards and visitors claimed to have heard these screams, and some asserted they saw a figure in period attire sprinting down the hallway. The veracity of these occurrences is less significant than their cultural impact. They preserved the memory of the executed and implied that injustice, even at the royal level, left indelible spiritual marks. Other prisons were associated with demonic or malevolent spirits rather than human specters. The prevailing notion was that locations of such concentrated human suffering attracted wicked supernatural entities. These beings were said to torment inmates, appearing in their cells at night, whispering sinister thoughts and driving them to delirium or self-harm. Whether these experiences stemmed from hallucinations induced by sensory deprivation, malnutrition, and psychological distress, or from actual supernatural encounters, depended on individual beliefs. Nevertheless, the narratives persisted and became embedded within the prison's folklore, augmenting the terror surrounding these establishments. The Castle of Otranto, though popularized by Horace Walpole's Gothic novel, was a genuine castle with real dungeons, and local folklore attributed various supernatural phenomena to the suffering that had transpired within its walls. Villagers reported observing peculiar lights in the castle ruins at night, hearing eerie sounds, and experiencing intense feelings of dread when in proximity to the castle. These folkloric elements offer insight into how medieval individuals processed the reality of hidden prisons. The actual conditions were so appalling that supernatural explanations appeared necessary for comprehension. How else could one account for places where human beings were held in conditions inferior to those of animals, places where individuals vanished without a trace, and where suffering was so profound it seemed to defy the natural order? The supernatural framework also provided a form of moral reckoning that the legal system frequently failed to supply. If earthly justice permitted the innocent to endure suffering in hidden dungeons, perhaps divine or supernatural justice would eventually restore balance. Through ghosts haunting their murderers, demons punishing the wicked, or spirits bearing witness to injustice. These supernatural entities fulfilled roles that human institutions did not. The concealed nature of these prisons rendered them ideal subjects for folklore, as people were unable to witness the actual events within them. The vacuum of confirmed information was filled by imagination, which tended towards the horrific. The reality was dire enough, but the imagined horrors were often more extreme. This served a social function beyond mere entertainment. The dread of hidden prisons, amplified by supernatural legends, contributed to the maintenance of social order. Individuals were less inclined to challenge authority if they believed defiance might result in imprisonment in a location populated by demons and vengeful spirits. The folklore surrounding prisons thus became a component of the mechanism of social control. However, this folklore also offered a form of resistance by constructing narratives where the spirits of prisoners haunted their oppressors. Common individuals asserted that injustice left indelible marks that could not be concealed, that the powerful could not entirely evade the repercussions of their actions, and that the victims of hidden prisons retained a measure of agency even in death. Religion occupied a complex and often contradictory position regarding hidden prisons. On one hand, the Church formally championed mercy and compassion towards inmates. Visiting prisoners was considered a corporal work of mercy, one of the charitable acts that Christians were encouraged to perform as a religious obligation. Certain religious orders dedicated themselves to providing spiritual solace and material aid to prisoners. The scriptural basis for this was explicit. Christ himself had stated, "I was in prison, and you came to me," signifying identification with the imprisoned and establishing care for prisoners as a religious duty. Medieval Christians took this injunction seriously, at least in principle. The challenge lay in translating this principle into practice, particularly when the prisons in question were deliberately concealed and access to inmates was strictly regulated. Religious confraternities focused on prisoner welfare existed in numerous medieval cities. These organizations would collect alms, visit prisons when permitted, supply food and clothing to inmates, and occasionally even settle prison debts to facilitate releases. The Misericordia of Florence, established in 1344, incorporated prisoner assistance as a core element of its charitable endeavors. Conversely, the Church also operated its own hidden prisons and was responsible for some of the most feared incarceration systems in medieval Europe. Ecclesiastical courts possessed the authority to sentence individuals to imprisonment for religious transgressions, and these sentences were frequently carried out in clandestine dungeons situated beneath monasteries or episcopal palaces. The contrast was stark and disquieting. The same institution that preached mercy and advocated for prisoner well-being also maintained prisons that, in many instances, were more severe than secular facilities. Ecclesiastical prisons often held individuals indefinitely without trial, subjected them to harsh conditions designed to break their spirit, and operated with even less oversight than their secular counterparts. This was not mere hypocrisy. Rather, it reflected a fundamental tension within medieval Christianity between mercy and judgment, between forgiveness and the imperative to punish heresy and uphold orthodoxy. Church officials genuinely believed that imprisoning heretics constituted an act of mercy, as it afforded them an opportunity to recant and avert eternal damnation. The temporary suffering of imprisonment was deemed insignificant in comparison to the eternal torment of hell. The Inquisition, in particular, developed highly sophisticated hidden prison systems. These facilities were designed not only to confine prisoners, but also to erode their resolve and extract confessions. The process was methodical and psychological in nature, extending beyond simple brutality. Prisoners were confined in isolation, provided with very limited sustenance, and subjected to relentless interrogations that could span numerous hours. These measures were all implemented with the express purpose of cultivating a state of absolute dependence and profound despair. The ultimate objective was to elicit a confession, a so-called coerced confession by today's standards. The Inquisition sought confessions of specific heretical beliefs and, crucially, required prisoners to identify other individuals who held similar views. This necessitated a careful calibration, applying sufficient duress to overcome resistance without causing the prisoner's demise or rendering them entirely incapable of coherent thought. The clandestine nature of inquisitorial detention facilities was fundamental to their operation. Had the populace been privy to the exact circumstances within these establishments, widespread indignation and opposition might have ensued. By maintaining the secrecy of the proceedings, the Inquisition preserved an atmosphere of enigma and apprehension, thereby amplifying its authority. It was understood that apprehension by the Inquisition signified an irrevocable descent into an obscured realm from which few departed unaltered, yet the specifics remained unknown. This very uncertainty served as a potent instrument of control. The methodologies employed by the Inquisition to extract confessions were meticulously documented in various procedural manuals. These texts demonstrate a sophisticated grasp of human psychology and the mechanisms by which isolation, ambiguity, and the controlled application of pressure could dismantle an individual's fortitude. Bernard G's manual, penned in the initial part of the 14th century, offers a detailed account of interrogation techniques, the maintenance of psychological strain, and the crucial judgment of when a prisoner was prepared to confess. Individuals incarcerated for religious transgressions, such as heresy, frequently experienced a profound testing of their faith. Some emerged from their confinement with their convictions fortified, perceiving their suffering as a divine trial or a form of martyrdom. They interpreted their harrowing experiences through religious paradigms that imbued them with significance and purpose. The Cathar heretics detained during the Albigensian Crusade often viewed their tribulations as tangible evidence of the corrupt material world and as validation of their dualistic theological tenets. Their readiness to endure atrocious conditions, rather than recant, reinforced their belief in the supremacy of the spiritual over the physical and in the promise of eternal reward. Conversely, others underwent a complete erosion of their faith, finding it impossible to reconcile their suffering with the concept of an all-benevolent deity. If God possessed omnipotence and inherent goodness, how could such suffering befall the innocent within concealed dungeons? This age-old query, echoing the dilemmas of Job, became acutely personal for those imprisoned believers. While some discovered resolutions that sustained their faith, others did not, relinquishing belief in favor of atheism or profound disillusionment. Still others developed syncretic belief systems, blending elements of their original faith with insights gleaned from their experiences in captivity. The extreme hardship and solitude of secret imprisonment could precipitate mystical episodes or psychological states that were interpreted as direct divine revelations. Prisoners might claim to have received novel interpretations of Scripture, visions that elucidated theological complexities, or direct communion with the divine. Whether these experiences stemmed from genuine spiritual enlightenment, the effects of mental anguish and hallucination, or deliberate deception remains indeterminable. However, they held profound reality for the individuals who underwent them and occasionally exerted influence beyond the confines of the prison, impacting broader religious movements. Certain unconventional religious doctrines can indeed be traced to visions or teachings that originated within prison cells. The provision of sanctuary offered a limited recourse to clandestine detention for specific defendants. Churches and monasteries possessed the capacity to grant sanctuary to fugitives, thereby shielding them from apprehension for a stipulated duration, typically 40 days. Throughout this period, the fugitive was effectively confined to the church grounds, barred from departure without facing arrest. Nevertheless, this offered the solace of presence in a public sphere rather than confinement in a hidden oubliette. This practice illuminates a significant aspect of medieval perspectives on incarceration. The widespread utilization of sanctuary suggests that clandestine imprisonment was regarded with such profound dread that individuals preferred confinement within a church, subsisting on charity and subject to restrictions on movement, over the peril of being conveyed to a secret dungeon. This comparison starkly illustrates the extent to which these hidden prisons were feared. The right of sanctuary possessed ancient roots, predating Christianity in Europe. It stemmed from the conviction that certain spaces were so sacrosanct that secular jurisdiction could not infringe upon them. A transgressor who reached the altar of a church was deemed under divine protection, a status that earthly powers were compelled to respect. This principle occasionally engendered conflict between ecclesiastical and civil authorities, when secular powers sought the apprehension of an individual who had claimed sanctuary. The resolution of these disputes varied, frequently involving negotiation. The fugitive might be granted safe passage into exile instead of imprisonment, permitting their departure from sanctuary without arrest. Alternatively, church officials might persuade the fugitive to voluntarily submit to legal proceedings, with the understanding of receiving more leniency than if apprehended forcefully. The efficacy of sanctuary as an alternative to hidden incarceration was contingent upon these negotiations and the readiness of secular authorities to honor ecclesiastical privileges. When relations between the church and the state were harmonious, sanctuary provided genuine protection. However, when these relations became strained, sanctuary could be abrogated, with soldiers breaching churches to apprehend fugitives despite the theoretical sanctity of the premises. Records indicate that sanctuary was indeed violated on numerous occasions, particularly when influential figures desired the confinement of specific individuals. Edward of England, for instance, commanded the arrest of several men who had sought sanctuary during his reign, explicitly disregarding ecclesiastical objections. This demonstrated that even hallowed locales could not guarantee absolute security against determined secular authority. The extensive use of sanctuary underscores how medieval populations perceived hidden prisons as places to be shunned at nearly any cost. It was deemed preferable to be confined within a church, where treatment would be transparent and conditions observable, than to vanish into subterranean dungeons, where the fate of the incarcerated remained unknown. Incarceration within hidden confines was primarily driven by warfare and political machinations, extending far beyond the purview of ordinary criminal justice. In contrast to common criminals, who might be housed in more visible local jails, political detainees and prisoners of war were often held in concealed locations, ensuring their security and keeping them from public view. High-value prisoners, including captured nobility, enemy commanders, and political adversaries, were particularly prone to confinement in hidden prisons. These captives represented considerable value, either for ransom or as instruments of political leverage, and their captors were keen to prevent their rescue or escape. Hidden prisons, with their multifaceted security measures and concealment, proved ideally suited for this objective. The clandestine nature of political imprisonment served several vital purposes. It obscured the location of the detainee from their supporters, rendering rescue attempts exceedingly difficult. It permitted authorities to disavow any knowledge of holding the prisoner should such denial prove politically advantageous. Furthermore, it cultivated an atmosphere of uncertainty and apprehension among potential dissenters, who understood that challenging established power could lead to disappearance within a hidden prison, with no certainty of their whereabouts or situation. Some political prisoners languished in hidden prisons for decades, becoming forgotten figures whose names were seldom uttered, their existence known only to a select cadre of guards and officials. When political circumstances shifted, such as the demise of an imprisoning ruler or a coup d'état, these prisoners might be abruptly released. They would emerge from their concealed confinement akin to specters from a bygone era, often struggling to adapt to a world that had continued without them. The narrative of the man in the iron mask, immortalized by Alexandre Dumas but grounded in historical fact, exemplifies the extreme measures employed in the clandestine imprisonment of political adversaries. The actual individual, whose identity remains a subject of scholarly debate, was held in various French prisons from 1669 until his death in 1703. He was perpetually masked, ostensibly to prevent recognition, and was frequently relocated between concealed sites to preclude the establishment of any discernible pattern. Whether the mask was indeed fashioned from iron, which is improbable, with velvet being a more likely material, is of lesser consequence than what the case represents. A system of imprisonment so deeply shrouded in secrecy that even the prisoner's visage had to be concealed. His identity was so thoroughly expunged that even centuries later, unequivocal certainty regarding his person eludes us. This epitomizes hidden imprisonment in its most absolute form, not merely sequestering an individual from society, but effectively obliterating their very identity. King John of England was a notable proponent of utilizing hidden imprisonment for political objectives. He detained a multitude of rival nobles and foreign captives in diverse castles across his domain, frequently shifting their locations to thwart rescue efforts. His purported cruelty towards these prisoners became the stuff of legend. Some allegedly perished from starvation, while others succumbed to madness induced by their confinement. One account recounts the alleged starvation to death of 22 knights held at Corfe Castle, purportedly on John's orders. The veracity of this account, whether a historical event or propaganda disseminated by John's adversaries, remains contested. However, the very currency of such narratives reveals the perception of hidden prisons as venues where authority could perpetrate any atrocity with impunity. The practice of detaining prisoners in undisclosed locations created avenues for abuse and barbarity that transcended even the stringent standards of medieval justice. Without oversight, without public awareness, authorities could act with impunity toward concealed detainees. Some endured severe interrogations. Others were simply forgotten, left to languish in their holding areas until they perished. Still others were silently put to death, their demises never officially acknowledged, their remains dealt with unceremoniously. The covert execution of prisoners held in secret facilities was particularly prevalent during periods of political upheaval or struggles for succession. A new leader might inherit detainees from their predecessor and determine that it posed less risk to eliminate them outright rather than countenance them becoming focal points for dissent. These killings would be conducted discreetly, with the prisoner's demise attributed to natural causes or not acknowledged at all. Edward II of England, after being deposed in 1327, was confined in Berkeley Castle, where he was murdered. Although the official narrative claimed he succumbed to natural causes, the reported method of murder was chosen specifically because it would leave no discernible external marks. A red-hot iron rod inserted into the anus. Whether this gruesome detail is factual or fabricated propaganda, it underscores the reality that individuals held in hidden custody were susceptible to any form of maltreatment or execution their captors elected to inflict. The logistical necessities of operating secret prisons demanded meticulous planning and security protocols that extended beyond the confines of the establishments. Provisions had to be delivered without drawing attention to the facility's whereabouts or revealing the number of inmates. Guards had to be compensated and monitored, but in ways that preserved confidentiality. Records were either meticulously maintained or deliberately omitted, depending on the desired level of secrecy. The supply chains for clandestine prisons were frequently intentionally opaque. Provisions might be acquired from numerous suppliers to preclude the establishment of a pattern that would indicate the prison's location or its occupancy. Restraints, locks, and other incarceration implements might be fabricated at one site and transported to another, with the ultimate destination kept undisclosed, even to the artisans who produced them. This diffusion of knowledge was strategic. No individual outside the core circle of authority was intended to possess comprehensive information regarding the hidden prison system. This compartmentalization of intelligence enhanced the system's security, but simultaneously complicated efficient administration. Dissemination of information had to be carefully controlled to prevent leaks while ensuring the facility's operational integrity. Jailers in covert prisons were carefully vetted for their allegiance and discretion. They needed to be sufficiently dependable to safeguard confidences, but also sufficiently unyielding to maintain control over inmates without direct supervision. Numerous jailers were former military personnel or individuals with criminal histories who were amenable to performing tasks others found unpleasant. They received substantial remuneration for their silence and their willingness to operate in obscurity. The dynamic between jailer and inmate within secret prisons differed fundamentally from that observed in recognized institutions. In publicly acknowledged prisons, jailers faced at least a degree of supervision and accountability. Their conduct toward prisoners might be scrutinized by visitors, inspectors, or other officials. However, in hidden prisons, jailers wielded virtually absolute authority over their charges, constrained only by directives from distant authorities who seldom investigated prevailing conditions. This unchecked power created avenues for both extraordinary brutality and unexpected leniency. Some jailers derived sadistic gratification from tormenting prisoners, secure in the knowledge that no one would intervene or even become aware of their actions. Others demonstrated unexpected compassion toward their charges, offering minor courtesies, supplementary food, intelligence from the outside, even chances for escape at considerable personal risk. Record-keeping in clandestine prisons was minimal and often deliberately imprecise. Official documentation might indicate that an inmate was held securely without specifying the location. Records of transfers might employ code names or numerical designations instead of actual identifiers. Certain prisoners were never officially documented at all. They effectively vanished into the hidden system, leaving no documentary trace of their existence. This intentional obscurity served several objectives. It hindered efforts by prisoners' families or proponents to locate them and mount rescue attempts or apply political pressure for their release. It provided a basis for plausible deniability for authorities wishing to disclaim custody of specific individuals, and it facilitated abuses that would have been impossible under a regime of proper documentation and oversight. The absence of records also implies that the full extent of secret incarceration in medieval Europe will never be known. We are aware of prisoners who were eventually freed or who left other evidence in the historical record. But how many inmates perished in concealed dungeons with neither their jailers nor captors knowing they had ever been imprisoned? How many individuals simply disappeared into this clandestine system and were entirely forgotten? This inscrutability is intrinsically part of the horror associated with hidden prisons. The system was devised to erase individuals not merely physically, but from the historical narrative itself. Their suffering, their accounts, their very presence could be expunged with no more than a failure to maintain records or a deliberate destruction of documents that might have preserved their memory. The conveyance of prisoners to and from secret prisons was executed with immense discretion, and often with deliberate cruelty, intended to disorient and demoralize. Inmates might be relocated during the night, hooded or blindfolded to prevent them from discerning their destination. The journey itself became an integral component of the punishment and a method of psychological manipulation. They might be transported in enclosed carriages or wagons that concealed them from public view, preempting any possibility of sympathizers spotting them and attempting a rescue. The routes undertaken were frequently circuitous, engineered to confuse the prisoner regarding their actual destination and to impede any pursuit aimed at determining their whereabouts. The intentional disorientation fulfilled several roles. A prisoner unaware of their confinement location could not impart that information to potential rescuers. The journey itself, conducted amidst darkness and confusion, intensified the psychological toll of imprisonment. By the time they reached their destination, inmates were already psychologically weakened, more pliable, and less inclined to resist. Richard II of England was transported to his confinement at Pontefract Castle in 1399 under conditions of extreme secrecy. He was moved at night, in disguise, along routes that were altered multiple times to forestall any prediction of his location. By the time he arrived at Pontefract, he had been so thoroughly disoriented and demoralized that when he was eventually murdered there, he reportedly offered minimal resistance. Medical attention within secret prisons was virtually non-existent, but the deficiency in healthcare was exacerbated by the clandestine nature of these facilities. In more visible prisons, there might have been some impetus to provide basic medical care, if only to avert disease outbreaks that could spread to the adjacent populace. In isolated prisons, there was no such impetus. Inmates who fell ill simply endured without treatment, and if they died, their deaths were seldom investigated or even officially recorded. The hidden character of these establishments meant that epidemics could be particularly devastating without any external awareness. When plague or typhus swept through a covert prison, claiming the lives of dozens or even hundreds of inmates, the fatalities might never be publicly disclosed. The bodies would be disposed of discreetly, frequently interred in unmarked graves or cast into rivers, and the outside world would remain oblivious to the occurrence of an epidemic. The psychological distress stemming from hidden imprisonment frequently manifested in physical symptoms, even after release. Prisoners developed chronic health conditions from their confinement, respiratory ailments from prolonged exposure to damp air, joint problems from sleeping on stone floors, visual impairments from extended periods in darkness. These tangible vestiges of incarceration persisted for the remainder of their lives. However, perhaps the most profound were the psychological scars that never healed. Former prisoners might react with alarm to sudden noises, experience panic in confined spaces, or suffer vivid nightmares decades after their liberation. What we would now categorize as post-traumatic stress disorder was prevalent among survivors of covert imprisonment. Although individuals in medieval times lacked a framework for comprehending or treating these conditions, the dreams of former inmates were often described as exceptionally vivid and disturbing. They would dream of being back in their cells, unable to escape, reliving all the terrors of imprisonment repeatedly. These dreams could be so powerful that prisoners would awaken disoriented, uncertain whether they were truly free, or if their liberation had been a dream, and their imprisonment the reality. Some prisoners never psychologically extricated themselves from their confinement, even after physical release. They remained mentally imprisoned, incapable of reintegrating into societal norms, unable to trust others, unable to believe they were genuinely free. They might live in isolation, refuse to enter enclosed areas, or adopt elaborate routines and rituals designed to maintain a sense of control and security. The communal structure within secret prisons, where it existed at all, was minimal and fragmented. In contrast to more visible prisons, where inmates might form social groups and establish hierarchies, hidden prisons were often deliberately structured to prevent the development of any sense of community. Prisoners were kept isolated from one another, denied the ability to communicate or forge alliances that could potentially threaten the prison's security. In circumstances where numerous individuals were held within the same concealed detention center, they could have been aware of one another's presence without ever meeting or conversing. Sounds might have emanated from adjacent cells, the sounds of coughing, weeping, or the clatter of chains, yet provided no means of identifying the source or the reason for their confinement. This cultivated a peculiar sensation of shared solitude, of being isolated in unison. Certain prisoners devised methods for communication despite the structural impediments designed to thwart such exchanges. They might tap on walls, employing elementary codes to transmit messages through the stone. This tapping system involved basic patterns of knocks symbolizing letters or commonplace phrases. While its efficacy was moderate, the psychological solace derived from knowing other human beings were nearby and attempting to connect was substantial. One documented method, utilized in various correctional facilities throughout Europe, was predicated on a 5x5 grid representing the alphabet. The initial sequence of taps designated the row, and the subsequent sequence indicated the column, enabling prisoners to gradually articulate messages. A greeting, like hello, would entail 5 taps for the row corresponding to H, followed by 3 taps for the column, then 2 taps for the row of E, and 1 tap for its column, and so forth. This process was exceedingly slow yet functional. They might leave inscribed messages in communal areas, visible to other inmates during movement through the prison. These etchings, carved into stone with fingernails, fragments of metal or sharpened bones, signified desperate attempts to communicate across distances of both time and space. A prisoner could scratch their name and the date, hoping that someone, anyone, would observe it and acknowledge their existence. The walls of medieval penitentiaries are adorned with these scratched inscriptions. Names, dates, supplications, imprecations, tallies denoting days or years, and declarations of innocence are found there. Each inscription represents an individual who refused to be entirely expunged, who insisted on leaving some vestige of their being. Undertaking tours of medieval prison sites today, one can still perceive these inscriptions. Faint marks on ancient stone, the final communications from individuals who perished centuries ago. These communicative endeavors carried inherent risks. Discovery by the custodians could lead to retribution, frequently involving the forfeiture of any minimal privileges the inmates possessed or additional torment. However, they were also indispensable for preserving mental fortitude. The awareness of proximity to fellow humans, the knowledge that one was not entirely alone, could be the determining factor between enduring and succumbing to psychological breakdown. The interpersonal dynamics among the custodians within covert detention facilities were equally intricate, shaped by the seclusion and ethical ambiguity inherent in their duties. These individuals labored in isolation, spending their days in somber, humid passageways surrounded by misery. The work exacted a psychological toll, manifesting in diverse ways. Some custodians became calloused and merciless, possibly as a defense against the culpability associated with their participation in the system. They might redirect their own frustrations and internal struggles onto the prisoners under their charge, engaging in casual barbarity that afforded them a sense of authority and dominion. The suffering they inflicted upon others became a mechanism for managing their own distress. Others developed a peculiar empathy for their charges, occasionally extending small mercies that were all the more valued for their unexpectedness. They might provide additional sustenance, relay messages to the prisoners' families, or offer warnings of impending transfers or executions. These gestures of compassion were perilous. If discovered, the custodian could face reprimand or dismissal. Nevertheless, they suggest that even within the deepest recesses of the penal system, human benevolence could occasionally prevail. Why would a custodian risk punishment to demonstrate kindness to inmates? The motivations were multifaceted. Some genuinely experienced sympathy for individuals they came to know through daily engagement. Others were impelled by remorse regarding their role within the framework. Still others perceived these minor acts of defiance against their superiors as a means of preserving their own sense of moral autonomy. Custodians in clandestine prisons frequently fostered their own distinct subculture, complete with its own regulations, hierarchies, and behavioral standards. Senior custodians held sway over junior ones and could make their lives exceedingly unpleasant if they so desired. Those assigned to the most remote, secure sectors commanded greater status than those in less critical areas. The prestige of the position was directly proportional to the grimness of the location. They developed their rieng, own jargon and coded language, ways of discussing their work that would be incomprehensible to outsiders. This linguistic segregation served to strengthen their collective identity and to create psychological distance between their professional personas and their civilian lives. By employing specialized terminology, they could deliberate on the dreadful aspects of their occupation without confronting the full moral gravity of their actions. The rotation of custodians was meticulously managed in most hidden prison systems. Continuous exposure to these conditions without respite could lead to psychological disintegration. Thus, the same individuals could not be permitted to serve indefinitely. Conversely, overly frequent rotation would jeopardize security. Each new custodian represented a potential conduit for information leaks. This equilibrium was typically achieved by maintaining a small contingent of permanent custodians, augmented by rotating assistants who had access only to limited sections of the system. The technological sophistication of hidden prisons was remarkable for their era, reflecting the paramount importance authorities ascribed to ensuring the security and concealment of these establishments. This was not rudimentary dungeon keeping. It was meticulously engineered confinement employing the most advanced materials and techniques available. Locks were intricate mechanisms that far surpassed simple latches. Medieval locksmiths developed locks requiring multiple keys. Some locks featured false keyholes designed to ensnare lockpicks, while others incorporated concealed mechanisms operable only with specific knowledge. Certain locks demanded not merely the correct key, but also an understanding of the precise method of its manipulation. Partial turns executed in specific sequences, if performed incorrectly, could permanently disable the lock. The locks safeguarding the most significant inmates were exemplars of medieval metallurgy and engineering prowess. Master locksmiths were commissioned to fabricate unique locking contraptions impervious to picking or duplication. These mechanisms could command a price equivalent to several months' wages for a skilled artisan, but the investment was deemed worthwhile for securing high-value detainees. Chains and restraints within hidden prisons were frequently more elaborate than those in visible facilities. Given that these prisoners were deemed particularly hazardous or valuable, heightened precautions were implemented. Some inmates were equipped with multiple sets of chains, one encircling the ankles, another the wrists, and a third the neck, all attached to disparate anchor points within the cell. This rendered movement virtually impossible, and escape entirely out of the question. The chains themselves were ingeniously designed. They needed to be robust enough to restrain prisoners securely, yet not so heavy as to inflict immediate, severe injury. Medieval engineers recognized that chains completely impeding circulation would lead to gangrene, resulting in a swift demise that might not align with the desired outcome. Consequently, the chains were engineered with just enough play to permit circulation while preventing any effective motion. The anchor points to which the chains were fastened to the walls were often the most robust components of the entire prison edifice. Iron rings were deeply embedded into the stone, encased in lead poured molten into the cavities to forge an unbreakable bond. Some of these anchor points, installed during the 12th or 13th centuries, remain intact today, serving as a testament to medieval engineering skill. The architectural design of hidden prisons incorporated numerous security features that were not immediately apparent to observers. False walls concealed additional barriers. An inmate who managed to breach one wall would encounter another behind it. Corridors featured concealed observation points from which guards could monitor prisoners undetected. These were often simple peepholes artfully integrated into decorative stonework. Certain cells possessed acoustic properties that enabled guards to overhear all conversations within while remaining entirely unseen. The dungeons within the Doge's palace in Venice were equipped with acoustic tubes that channeled sound to listening posts, allowing guards to monitor prisoner discussions without their knowledge. This served the dual purpose of intelligence gathering and preventing prisoners from conversing freely, even when they believed themselves to be in private. Illumination within hidden prisons was rigorously controlled and employed as a tool of power. Torches and candles were costly and also posed a fire hazard in these enclosed environments, hence their utilization was infrequent. For the most part, prisoners existed in near absolute darkness. When light was introduced, it was typically for the convenience of guards or officials conducting inspections, not for the inmates. This dominion over light represented another form of control. The capacity to see or remain unseen, to illuminate or plunge into darkness, resided entirely with the custodians. An inmate might endure weeks without perceiving any light beyond the faint luminescence occasionally filtering down from upper levels. When torches were brought to their cells, the sudden brilliance was agonizing, their eyes having grown accustomed to the dark. The stark contrast between the darkness in which prisoners lived and the abrupt illumination during inspections or interrogations was deliberately disorienting. The fluctuation in light levels could induce temporary blindness, headaches, and confusion, rendering prisoners more susceptible to interrogation and less capable of accurately assessing their circumstances. The milieu of hidden prisons was characterized by a culture of silence and secrecy that extended far beyond the physical confines. All individuals involved in these systems, from the highest echelons of authority to the lowest-ranking guards, understood that the events transpiring within hidden prisons were not to be divulged. This code of silence was maintained through a combination of allegiance, dread, and personal advantage. Those who divulged information risked not only their professions, but possibly their very existences. A guard who exposed secrets concerning concealed detainees might find himself transformed into a detainee. A jailer who spoke too freely about the treatment of inmates could be accused of betrayal or heresy. The repercussions for breaching the code of silence were grave enough that the majority of individuals opted to remain silent, irrespective of what they witnessed. This atmosphere of concealment extended to the detainees themselves, those fortunate or unfortunate enough to eventually be set free. Former occupants of hidden dungeons frequently discovered that nobody wished to hear about their ordealed experiences. Society preferred to uphold the pretense that such locations did not exist, or that the events within them were either warranted or essential. Speaking too openly about your ordealed experiences as a prisoner could be perilous. You might be accused of exaggeration or deceit, thereby jeopardizing your credibility and social standing. Alternatively, you might be believed, in which case you would become the source of uncomfortable truths that authorities might decide to silence permanently. In either scenario, candidness about hidden imprisonment seldom yielded favorable outcomes. Certain former prisoners penned narratives of their ordealed experiences, yet these writings were frequently subjected to censorship, suppression, or dismissed as unreliable. The account of John Bunin chronicles his imprisonment in Bedford County Jail, although this represented a comparatively lenient form of incarceration when contrasted with hidden dungeons. Nevertheless, his narrative offers insight into the challenges of conveying the reality of confinement to individuals who had never endured it. The clandestine nature of these prisons engendered a form of collective amnesia. Because they were not visible, because they were not discussed, they could be forgotten, even while they continued to operate. Generations of people resided in medieval cities, passing by the entrances to hidden prisons daily, unaware or unthinking of what lay beneath their feet. This amnesia served the authorities conveniently, enabling them to sustain systems of imprisonment that would have been controversial or unacceptable had they been publicly known. It allowed them to make individuals vanish without the necessity of publicly justifying or explaining their actions. Furthermore, it permitted them to evade confronting the ethical implications of their deeds. The culture surrounding hidden prisons also encompassed a peculiar brand of dark humor. Jailers developed jests and anecdotes concerning their work, as a means of coping with the grim realities of their daily lives and managing the psychological strain of their role in human suffering. Some of these narratives have endured in folklore and literature. Tales of prisoners who descended into madness, of spectral beings that haunted the cells, of narrow escapes and dramatic apprehensions. These stories serve to normalize the system of hidden imprisonment, rendering it akin to a mere facet of medieval existence rather than the moral atrocity it truly was. By making light of imprisonment, by transforming genuine suffering into entertaining narratives, individuals could emotionally distance themselves from the reality of what transpired in these locales. However, the jests also functioned as a form of acknowledgement. They conceded that something dreadful was occurring, even if that concession was couched in amusement. The laughter was tinged with nervousness and discomfort. It was the laughter of individuals who recognized their complicity in wrongdoing, but felt powerless to effect change. Migration patterns were influenced by the reputation of hidden prisons in ways that were both subtle and significant. People did not consistently know the precise locations of hidden prisons. That was part of their clandestine design. However, they were aware of which regions and which rulers were known for making individuals disappear. Merchants, voyagers, and prospective migrants would steer clear of areas recognized for their severe justice and clandestine imprisonments when alternative options were available. Venice's reputation for efficient yet covert justice caused many merchants to feel uneasy about conducting business there, notwithstanding the city's commercial importance. The papal territories were avoided by anyone who might be suspected of holding heterodox religious beliefs. The existence of hidden prisons cultivated an atmosphere of fear that extended considerably beyond the actual number of individuals incarcerated. The awareness that one could be apprehended in the dead of night, that one could vanish without a trace, that no one would know of one's whereabouts or one's circumstances. This awareness shaped people's conduct, their speech, and their interactions with authority. This dread served as a form of social control that proved remarkably effective precisely because it was rooted in hidden systems that most people never directly witnessed. Had prisons been visible and their operations transparent, individuals might have been able to rationally assess the actual risk of imprisonment and respond accordingly. But because the system was concealed, because no one knew exactly how it functioned or who might be targeted, everyone had to assume they could be at risk. This uncertainty rendered individuals cautious, compliant, and hesitant to challenge authority in ways that might attract notice. Self-censorship became instinctive. People learned to refrain from expressing opinions that could be construed as critical of rulers or supportive of opposition. They learned to avoid associating with individuals who might be under suspicion. They learned not to be overly conspicuous, overly successful, or overly distinct. The psychological ramifications of living under the threat of hidden imprisonment affected entire societies. It fostered cultures of suspicion, wherein neighbors informed on one another, where trust was perilous, and where safety appeared to necessitate constant vigilance and conformity. These societal patterns, once established, could endure for generations, even after the specific threat had diminished. Certain regions developed particular reputations as locales where individuals vanished. The Papal States were recognized for their extensive network of hidden prisons utilized to confine religious dissenters and political adversaries. The Venetian Republic possessed a formidable system of covert arrests and imprisonments, with detainees held in concealed cells beneath the Doge's palace, accessible only to a select number of officials. The Venetian system of clandestine imprisonment was so efficacious and so feared that it became a model studied and occasionally emulated by other powers. The Council of Ten, Venice's security apparatus, possessed the authority to order arrests that were executed under the cover of night without public proclamation. Prisoners would simply disappear, conveyed through secret passageways to hidden cells, with only the council members privy to their location and fate. These reputations exerted an influence not only on migration, but also on commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Regions notorious for hidden imprisonment found it more challenging to draw merchants, scholars, and skilled laborers, as individuals understandably hesitated to settle in places where they might vanish without warning or recourse. The long-term consequences of hidden prison systems extended significantly beyond the individual prisoners who suffered within them. These systems profoundly shaped medieval society, cultivating cultures of fear, secrecy, and arbitrary authority that persisted for centuries and influenced the evolution of subsequent justice systems and political structures. For the families of vanished prisoners, the clandestine nature of the system engendered a unique form of anguish. When an individual disappeared into a hidden prison, their families often remained unaware of their whereabouts, whether they were alive or deceased, or what actions they could take to provide assistance. This uncertainty was, in some respects, more agonizing than knowing one's loved one had been executed, as execution at least offered closure and facilitated the commencement of the grieving process. Certain families dedicated years to searching for their disappeared loved ones, traveling from city to city, attempting to bribe officials for information, and pursuing rumors and hints that typically led to dead ends. The majority of these searches proved fruitless. The system of hidden imprisonment was devised to make individuals vanish entirely, and it was remarkably successful in achieving this objective. The Countess of Richmond dedicated years to searching for her son, Henry Tudor, following his flight from England during the Wars of the Roses. Although he was not technically imprisoned, he was in hidden exile, and her inability to ascertain his location or well-being caused anguish akin to that experienced by families of imprisoned loved ones. Her eventual success in aiding him in his ascent to the throne as Henry VII was an exceptional occurrence. Most families never located their vanished relatives. The economic repercussions of hidden imprisonment were substantial, impacting both individual families and society as a whole. When breadwinners vanished, families were left without support, frequently descending into poverty. Businesses failed when key merchants or artisans were apprehended. Properties were confiscated or fell into disrepair. The cascading effects could devastate entire communities. Furthermore, because the imprisonment was concealed, there was no official acknowledgement of the loss, no compensation, and no recognition that any event had transpired. Families of disappeared prisoners existed in a legal and social liminality, unable to remarry, in the case of spouses, as they could not officially establish the death, and unable to inherit property because the legal standing of the disappeared individual remained unclear. This state of uncertainty could persist for decades. Some families waited for years or even generations for disappeared relatives to return or for confirmation of their deaths. Without such confirmation, they were unable to move forward with their lives. They existed in a perpetual state of uncertainty and grief that offered no resolution. The psychological impact on society at large was considerable. The knowledge that hidden prisons existed, that individuals could vanish without a trace, fostered a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and distrust. People exercised caution regarding what they said and to whom they said it. They avoided political discussions that might be overheard and misinterpreted. They did not question authority, even when that authority was conspicuously unjust. The clandestine prison system, despite affecting comparatively few individuals within the broader populace, profoundly influenced the conduct of entire communities. It served as one of the instruments by which medieval sovereigns maintained dominion over their subjects, not through perpetual overt repression, but by the ever-present potential for vanishing. The legal ramifications of these hidden penal establishments are intricate yet significant. Numerous transgressions that transpired within these confines, clandestine apprehensions, protracted incarceration without judicial review, a deficit of oversight, and the intentional infliction of torment are now prescribed by law in the majority of nations. The evolution of legal safeguards, such as habeas corpus, the entitlement to be apprised of the accusations levied against oneself, the right to an expeditious trial, and prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment, can all be viewed as responses to the hidden prison infrastructures of earlier epochs. Habeas corpus, originating in English common law and subsequently codified in the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, was specifically conceived to thwart secret imprisonments. It mandates that authorities present detainees before a tribunal and offer justification for their confinement, thereby precluding their indefinite obscurity without due legal process. This prerogative is, in essence, the right to have one's physical person, corpus, produced in court, thereby preventing one's disappearance into a concealed system. Nevertheless, the development of these legal protections was a gradual and hard-won endeavor. Authorities resisted the imposition of constraints upon their prerogative to imprison, contending that state security necessitated the capacity to detain potentially dangerous individuals without public scrutiny or oversight. The perennial conflict between security and liberty, between the authority to incarcerate and the right to freedom, has persisted as a central political quandary from medieval times to the present day. The inclination to establish concealed detention systems endures throughout history. Governing bodies have repeatedly endeavored to create environments where conventional regulations cease to apply, where individuals can be held beyond public cognizance or supervision, and where accountability is suspended in the interest of security. The medieval hidden prison is more than a mere historical curio. It is a blueprint that has been repeatedly employed in diverse manifestations across different eras, from the Bastille to the gulags to Guantanamo Bay. The architectural heritage of clandestine penal facilities remains tangible in numerous medieval edifices. Visiting these sites today, now accessible to tourists and scholars, reveals spaces that were conceived to be observed solely by their victims and custodians, such as the dungeons of the Tower of London, the subterranean chambers beneath the Doge's palace, and the oubliettes within French castles. These locations persist as concrete evidence of a system of hidden imprisonment that shaped medieval society. Traversing these spaces in the present day, one can still apprehend an essence of their original intent. The confined corridors that compel single-file movement, the low ceilings necessitating a stoop, the substantial walls that dampen sound, and the pervasive darkness that persists even with the installation of modern illumination. These architectural characteristics were not accidental. They were deliberate choices made by individuals who understood how to leverage spatial design for control, intimidation, and the subjugation of the human spirit. The emotional resonance experienced by many visitors to these locales is telling. Even with the knowledge of one's ability to depart at any moment and the presence of fellow tourists with cameras and guidebooks, an oppressive atmosphere pervades these environments. The accumulation of suffering that occurred within these walls seems to linger in the very stones. Standing within a medieval oubliette, contemplating the iron rings that once held chains, and deciphering the desperate inscriptions etched by long-departed prisoners, one is compelled to confront the reality of past events. These were not abstract historical occurrences, but lived experiences for individuals who felt pain, fear, and despair with an intensity commensurate with our own in analogous circumstances. The cultural imprint of secret prisons is evident throughout literature, folklore, and popular consciousness. The archetypes of the clandestine dungeon, the concealed cell, and the vanished prisoner resurface as recurring motifs in narratives spanning from the medieval period to contemporary times. These themes tap into profound anxieties concerning powerlessness, vulnerability to arbitrary authority, and the forfeiture of one's identity and connection to the world. Such narratives fulfill vital functions beyond mere diversion. They keep alive the memory of clandestine prisons and their consequences. They serve as a reminder that secret detention systems have existed and could re-emerge. They caution us to remain vigilant against the impulse to establish environments where ordinary rules are suspended, where individuals can be made to disappear, and where accountability is disavowed. The moral legacy of hidden prisons is perhaps the most profound and challenging aspect to confront. These systems represented a fundamental dereliction of human dignity and justice, predicated on the notion that certain individuals could be sequestered from society, concealed, and treated as less than human, free from accountability or oversight. This premise is morally indefensible, yet it was widely embraced within medieval society. How could societies, deeply devout and professing a belief in human worth and divine justice, countenance systems of hidden imprisonment? A partial explanation lies in the efficacy of concealment itself. That which is not seen, and of which one is unaware, does not necessitate moral reckoning. The covert nature of these facilities allowed individuals to evade confronting the reality of actions perpetrated in their name. However, this constituted willful ignorance rather than genuine innocence. People were aware of the existence of secret prisons, even if the specific details remained unknown. They understood that individuals vanished and were not seen again. They recognized that challenging authority entailed risks, including imprisonment under dire conditions. They elected not to inquire, not to demand accountability, because it was safer and more convenient to avert their gaze. Comprehending clandestine prisons aids our understanding of how societies can normalize atrocity. When systems operate in secrecy, their mechanisms concealed from public scrutiny and devoid of transparency or accountability, the potential for terrible deeds arises. Individuals who would openly condemn cruelty can become participants in cruel systems when these systems are obscured and their involvement is mediated through bureaucratic distance. The medieval hidden prison teaches us the paramount importance of visibility, transparency, and accountability. When we permit systems to function covertly, when we accept that certain matters are best left unrevealed, and when we refrain from questioning what transpires in the shadows, we create the conditions ripe for abuse and atrocity. The individuals who endured suffering within these hidden locales deserve remembrance not as abstract historical footnotes, but as sentient beings who faced unimaginable isolation and uncertainty. Every scratch on every wall, every tally mark denoting days, every desperate message inscribed on stone stands as a testament to human beings who refused complete erasure, who insisted on leaving some vestige of their existence even in places designed for their obliteration. Their suffering was not in vain. It imparts a vital lesson on the significance of visibility, transparency, and the refusal to accept that some truths are better left concealed. It impels us to question what occurs in the shadows, to demand accountability from those who wield power, and to assert that no individual should possess the capacity to make others disappear without consequence. The concealed world of medieval prisons is no longer clandestine. We have brought it into the light, scrutinized it, and understood it, thereby diminishing its power. This is because the most potent weapon of covert systems is secrecy. Once that secrecy is breached, once we comprehend what occurred and how it transpired, we can endeavor to prevent its recurrence. Thank you for accompanying me on this exploration into the obscured corners of history. If you found this examination beneficial, kindly bestow a like and subscribe. And recall, the next time you traverse a medieval castle or fortress, contemplate what might lie beneath your feet. Consider the hidden spaces, the forgotten prisoners, and the systems that operated covertly, and ask yourself, what clandestine systems exist in our present era? And what are we doing to bring them to light? Until our next encounter, remain inquisitive, persist in your questioning, and never concede that some things are best left concealed.